Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Fantastic, brilliant, great.
From here.
Great. Okay, so hello everybody.
Just mute their microphone. Sorry, alright.
Okay, can you hear me better now? Is that better? Hello, can you hear me now?
I think everybody else just mute their microphone.
Working?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Your little Skype window is in the middle of your presentation screen. Is that mine? Never mind.
Okay, brilliant. So, good evening everybody and welcome to Journal Club, GASOC's Journal Club for February 2019. Today we have two papers that we'll be discussing, and the first of it is Ethical Considerations in Global Surgery by Stahl et al. Okay, so this paper essentially discusses the principles of healthcare in the context of global surgery. Some of the principles that were discussed, as we all know, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice.
Your presentation not showing partly.
Hello?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Are you happy for us to go ahead, Stuart?
Can you not hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Hello? Okay, fantastic, brilliant. Okay, seems like we're connected now finally. Okay, so the ethical considerations of global surgery that we'll be discussing today, we'll be starting from the principles of healthcare ethics in the context of global surgery with regards to beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. To begin with beneficence, doing what's in the patient's best interest. Of course, with global surgery, it's assumed that going and contributing to global surgery efforts will always be in the patient's best interest, but we'll go into details as to the different considerations that come into play. Non-maleficence, specifically in terms of doing the least harm possible to reach a beneficial outcome. Autonomy and justice. Autonomy in terms of deciding what the patient wants and going ahead with that. And justice specifically is quite relevant in global surgery with regards to doing what's fair to both parts in terms of the visiting global surgeon and the host country and the consideration of equality as well. So this paper highlights quite nicely a definition of global surgery that was taken from a paper by Dare et al. And this paper talks about global surgery specifically, not just to do with practice of global surgery, but highlights the different aspects of global surgery which we need to consider, such as study, research, advocacy, and specifically how it very often applies to underserved populations. So some of the different aspects that we'll be talking about today, one of the different aspects we'll be talking about today includes surgical tourism. And surgical tourism essentially is defined by the paper as visiting surgeons from higher income countries traveling to lower income countries and delivering care in whatever regard, whether capacity building, clinical duties, lots of different aspects that come into play when surgical tourism is considered. And one of the things that was spoken about in terms of surgical tourism is that quite often it's actually beneficial not just to the host country, but also to the trainees to the host country in terms of the resources made available, the fact that visiting surgeons add to the personnel available on ground. They can go across and take new ideas, new techniques, equipment as well. And with regards to the trainee, new experiences, opportunities to improve their technical skills. This paper does discuss justice with regards to surgical tourism. I'll just go back to that slide before we move on. It talks about justice with regards to surgical tourism in the sense that we need to consider whether the cost of sending high-income trainees is justifiable against the benefits to low-income countries. And also brings up the conversation of whether the resources available in these lower-income countries are best spent on high-income country trainees. So going to one of the topics that was highlighted was the rights of the patient. And this paper talks about how when a visiting surgeon goes to a lower income country, they go and provide surgical services, and you need to consider the rights of the patient, whether this surgeon is in the best position to deliver these services to the patient, because obviously you need to consider this surgeon may not be familiar with the environment, may not be familiar with the system, and this may lead to delays in the patient's treatment. Whereas on the other hand, it's arguable where resources are so limited, is it better for a patient to be treated by someone who's not familiar rather than not receiving any treatment at all? And then the next thing it talks about is trainees' experiences. And it mentions that a lot of trainees generally have had good experiences, with over 75% of them reporting positively in terms of their operating experiences. They have all, however, mentioned things such as being exposed to infectious diseases, depending on where they travel to, and being in unfamiliar environments, facing challenges with being in an unfamiliar environment. Another important point that was raised by this paper is competition. So, as we all know, in every different country, there's always going to be competition between surgical trainees for training opportunities. Specifically with global surgery is the discussion of competition between trainees in these low-income countries against trainees from higher income countries, and again raising the discussion of where there are limited resources in these countries, is it beneficial for these countries for these resources to then be taken up by, to some extent, by high income country trainees. And then another thing that is discussed is trainee preparation, where trainees may have gone across to low income countries and may not have felt adequately supervised, and what the resulting effects from these may be. And finally, it talks about exploitation in the context of global surgery, recognizing that a lot of these countries may very well be filled with vulnerable populations, and essentially deciding, when a trainee goes across or a visiting surgeon goes across, it's worth considering that whatever services are being provided are equally beneficial to both parties, and making sure that we're not, that visiting surgeons are not just going across and seeking whatever their interests might be, making sure that there's a need and that their practice is addressing this need. So another aspect of ethical consideration in global surgery raised by this paper is surgical education, and that's been discussed very briefly previously in the other slide. But specifically, one of the things it was talking about was the SAO group, which is an SAO group is essentially made up of a surgeon, an anaesthetist, and an obstetrician. And it's been deemed that in order to achieve 5,000 operations per 100,000 by 2030, lower income countries, across the world, there needs to be an average of 20 SAOs per 100,000 population, which means that in these countries we need to train, overall across the world, 1.27 million global surgeons, 1.27 million anaesthetists, 1.27 million obstetricians. And of course, within these countries where there's limited resources, not just financially, but also with trainers, highlighting again the potential burden that might be added on by high-income trainees visiting. And then goes on to discuss the issue of brain drain. As highlighted by the paper, $500 million is the number that's essentially been spent by African countries. So $500 million is the amount that this study is highlighted has been spent by African countries on training healthcare workers within just year 2005, who eventually relocated to high-income countries. And then another, Stuart, sorry, I can't actually hear you. Do you mind just messaging? I can't hear what you're trying to pass across. So in terms of surgical research, this was another aspect that was discussed in this paper. Surgical research, according to this paper, only 4% of surgical research worldwide is actually contributed to by LMICs, and it has ascertained to possible reasons why this is the case. There's the suggestion that it might be because good quality research requires a lot of time, a basic understanding of research methodology, access to local biostatisticians, might be limited by access to scientific journals, and also the fact that when research is done in low to middle income countries, there have been situations in which credit was not necessarily given. So essentially, these are possible reasons why we don't see a greater amount of research coming out of low and middle income countries. However, apart from those reasons, it does also talk about the fact that a lot of surgeons within low middle income countries often have to substitute for pathologists, oncologists, radiologists, where there may not be other specialists available, and actually they may have to do a greater burden of the entire surgical treatment pathway beyond just operating. They may be responsible for diagnosis and management, and actually begs the question: can they truly, can they actually afford the time for this, for the research that we would like to see, and would benefit the world as a whole, to be honest. And finally, one of the points raised by this paper were Shine's 7 sins of humanitarian medicine, which it advises we need to be careful not to commit in global surgery, beginning with leaving a mess behind, failing to match technology to local needs, which has been seen in cases where global surgeons may sometimes provide equipment when they go on trips. However, the question is whether these materials, these machines, are relevant and useful to these countries. Do these countries have the resources to actually maintain this equipment? And then there's also the discussion of failure of NGOs to cooperate with each other, in which case you may have multiple NGOs concentrated in a particular country or a particular aspect of the world, and maybe not spread out across the need that actually exists. Stuart, you're breaking up. Please send a message. And then there's the discussion of follow-up plans, which actually is very relevant to surgery because, of course, we know that when post-operative complications occur, you need to consider who these will be followed up by. And in terms of global surgery, it's something to just consider when we may be planning trips. Another aspect is allowing politics. It advises not to allow politics to trump service. It mentions going to areas where help is not wanted or needed. That's something we need to avoid doing. We need to make sure that we, as much as we can within our capacity, assess what the needs of the local area will be, serving will be, and make sure that we equip ourselves to the best of our abilities to address these needs. And finally, making sure we're not doing the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, we're seeing that.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Yes, brilliant. So, any questions?
Thank you for excellent presentation. My one question, probably I have others, but this article seems to discourage people coming from HIC to RMICs, but we can't ignore what the contribution of HIC for RMICs. That's one consideration for this article.
Yeah.
And also, I think we have to work together hand in hand. So there is the, when HIC comes here in the LMICs, there is one contribution they can make, but also there is some benefit they can get. So I think we have to think in that way that there is benefit on both sides. People, what they have to do is to balance and also make sure everyone is getting what he needs or what he wants, but in a way it is protecting everyone. That is my comment. And another comment for research limitation in LMICs, as you have said, we have a limitation of staff.
Wait,
Can
what
you hear?
you were saying seemed to tail off. Yeah. It's just seemed. Is it what you're saying? Hi, we can hear you, Dave. Yep.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Stuart? Hello? Stuart, are you still on the call?
Me, I'm still on the call.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
It seems we are two on call. Others, I don't know if they can hear.
We can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I think Stuart was trying to say something, but it seems to be breaking.
Yeah, it might be better if you just types it in.
Oh, okay.
I think he's typing.
That's fine. Joseph, you carry on.
Okay, thank you. So what I was saying, we have some limitation in our settings. As Ola said, we have a problem with staff, so we have not many people trained in carrying good research, and also we have resources like human resources and also equipment, and also we have we don't have like a statistician as you also presented, but also another challenge is to have research which is somehow oriented or guided by people coming from HIC. For example, you may come and say you are going to conduct research, for example, for NCDs. So every funding will be oriented for NCDs. And another one will come and say, I'm going to do research on HIV or malaria. So sometimes one challenge is to have not having research coming from to solve problem from LMICs, and but having like researches which are oriented not to responding to the population need. Those are my comments for this paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. I think you raise a very valid point, which is ensuring that we're addressing what the need is and making sure that global surgery efforts recognize and, as much as we can, do all the research that we can before we even start making these trips to find out what the need is before we start making project plans and addressing. And there's the recent Lancet paper, which I know has had lots of different views, which and this paper talks about post-operative mortality rates in across global surgery. I think papers like that are important in order to start addressing where the problems are, trying to gather as much information as we can, so that we can see and ensure that the projects we're working towards and the partnerships we're building are addressing what the specific needs are. Thank you. Hope I can hear you trying to talk. Yeah, there we go. Robo, I think you're muted. I can see that you're. Still muted, Robo, I think. Nivi, were you going to say something?
Yeah, let me just see if Robo manages to get on the line. Not yet. Well, in the meantime, I just think that was a fantastic presentation. So thank you for that, RA. I really, really like the article, and I think I speak for the group here as well, that the ethical considerations are something that's more and more important going forward, especially with global surgery becoming a bigger field and with more and more people wanting to get involved, especially from HICs. So yeah, very good presentation, really enjoyed it. One of the things that I wanted to comment on from your presentation with regards to global surgery trainees coming to countries, let's say like South Africa, for example, where you mentioned there possibly being competition in terms of access to different procedures or training or teaching. Personally, or in the Johannesburg circuit at least, I can speak for, I don't think that that's a big problem.
Oh, interesting.
Just in terms of the numbers that we see, it's insane. And the hours that we work, we don't have restriction on our working hours like you do in the UK. So help in that regard would be very appreciated.
Interesting.
I got back to Ped Surge here and looked at one of their M&M stats. And in the year I spent in Oxford in ped surgery, that was one slide of December worth of operating. So in terms of competition, I haven't experienced that amongst the registrars, like in the South African circuit. There's no competition for cases and that kind of stuff.
That was great, thanks, sir. I
don't think, Stuart, I think Nivi was just speaking. I think his internet's breaking up, so he can't necessarily tell. Carry on, Nivi.
Yeah, so that's one facet of things. That's a bit of a different viewpoint. What else did I want to say? In terms of the ASID paper that recommends the guidelines for global surgery trainees going to other countries, I think as a whole, I think it's what we need. We do need career fields in global surgery.
We can hear you, Joseph. Just continue.
Yes, I'm on a problem. Me, I'm fine.
Hello.
Yes.
Nivi's just speaking.
Yeah.
I think the internet connection must be breaking across different countries. It's great that we have so many people joining in. We'll just let Nivi finish what she's saying if everyone can hear me, and then I will let you know when she's done so you can speak, Stuart.
What was I saying?
Talking about the ASID paper about trainees coming across.
Oh, yes. Something about that I was thinking about is they very strictly, mentioned that trainees coming from elsewhere need to have good supervision. That isn't something that's very clearly defined.
Okay.
And I think that's something that's super, super important to look into, and that's something that I've found huge. Just contrasting the difference between the UK and here. I know the ethical consideration paper also had to deal with, a lot of people that have come to work in trauma in the South African setting.
Yes.
And there's a few of us here that have worked in trauma departments in Johannesburg hospitals, and as F1s, we were supervising the kind of junior doctors that had come across from the UK. So the level there needs to be established. Like you said, very, very importantly, which I think was really good, Ora, is that we don't just function as surgeons here. It's not a very specific role where you only operate and, that's all you're responsible for. And we don't have resuscitation teams in South Africa where if there's a resus, you push a bell and a resus team comes across. If you're a surgeon and it's a surgical patient that needs a resus, you need to run that resus. If you're an obstetrician, if you are, a physician, all those skills are stuff that you're going to have to come with to the country.
Okay.
So I think the level of supervision that they mention is something that really, really needs to be defined very clearly before we start sending global surgery trainees from HICs to LMICs.
Great, thank you, Nivi. I do have a presentation about the ASID paper as well, and I think you've raised a very valid point. We'll talk about that once we're talking about that paper. I think it's very true. I think it's a recognition of the differences between surgical practice in HICs versus LMICs, and papers like this are good at highlighting those differences because, of course, if you've never experienced it, it might not be something you would consider. And I suppose actually it's even great that we have meetings such as this, because then we can have contribution from people such as yourself who have experienced both sides and can say, actually, if you were to come across, these are the kind of things you need to expect. These are the kind of things where if you're working in a surgical team, you are the surgeon, you're the resus lead, you're this and that, and just essentially preparing people's minds so they know what will be expected of them. Thank you. So we have some questions on Robo. Have you been able to unmute yourself yet? Still muted. Yes, please type your question. I'll read out Roba's typing in case we have people on YouTube who can't see it. So she has a commentary.
Meanwhile, she's typing, so okay.
Okay, so Roba's first question is about the background of the authors, and Stein, who was the first named author on the paper, is actually works in the Division of Surgery in Cape Town, South Africa. So I suppose I see you with Nivi. So I suppose, and then the next question is, do you feel they're qualified to be writing this piece? Who do we think should take up responsibility for setting up / implementing an ethical framework? So the two authors for this paper are both seem to be surgeons in South Africa. Are they qualified to be writing this piece? I believe they've written it from their perspective. I think it would probably be best balanced if it was contributed to by a surgeon who works in a high income country, and then that balances both sides of the conversation. Who do we think should take up responsibility for setting up and implementing an ethical framework? That is a fantastic question. And to be honest, I don't know who should take responsibility for setting up an ethical framework. I suppose it would have to be, Nivi, what were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say that in response to Robert's question, that I think is something that would have to be completely collaborative.
Yeah.
In terms of setting up, ethical frameworks, it can't come from one side. In terms of the specifics and which departments, etc., do that, that's probably a whole bureaucratic process that I have no idea. But it's something that definitely has to be double-sided.
I think it's good that we're having these discussions. I think eventually it will probably come to a point where global surgeons across the world in high income countries as well as low income countries will have to have a sit down and come up with some kind of framework that both sides will be happy, or all parties will be happy to abide by, some kind of gold standard or some kind of ethical framework, and then decide that all parties need to be answerable to that. But in terms of who takes responsibility beyond that, that's a difficult thing to put on one particular group. I think it would have to be different groups and every global surgeon who decides to go ahead. Stuart's made some comments, and his comments are about, we need to be careful not to think that the UK training should be automatically regarded as gold standard. We also have problems. Arguably, we are over-regulated and over-supervised. I was ST5, which is essentially 2 or 3 years before consultant or attending, if you're joining us from other parts of the world, before I was allowed to do inguinal hernias on my own. So that is a very valid point. Ethical frameworks
I completely agree
great.
with Stuart in that regard.
Yes, exactly, because you've experienced both sides, so it must have been quite an interesting.
Yeah, those were my comments, because when people come from HIC to RMICs, they can benefit from practice because we have much to do in our setting, but also on our side also we can benefit for theoretical knowledge, but also work with other people who have studied in the ideal setting. I think that also it is one way of thinking. I don't know what other people can think about that.
Sorry, Joseph, can you just say that again, please?
So I was saying that my comment were also about the same way, saying that if you come to practice in the LMICs from HICs,
Yeah.
you need to give only, you get something at least. So you have exposure to many cases, different cases. And also on our side, also we can benefit from HICs, from people coming from good background with organize the things, how to do everything in a way standardized.
Yeah.
I think that also is helpful.
With regards to that's very true, and actually, in regards to your point, your comment, Joseph, can I ask, in your experience, what have you found to be most, in your experience, the most overall beneficial type of global surgery practice in your experience? Have you found that it's the techniques that visiting surgeons have brought across, or like you said, has it been the standardization of practice, or maybe research? What has been your experience been?
What we benefit a lot is the standardization of a practice, and also we learn how to be organized, and also another thing we learn from training from HICs is to make our own programs. It is very good.
You mean training programs?
Yes, training programs.
That's a very good point. The paper does talk about how, with regards to brain drain and doctors leaving LMICs, that it's been found that 93% of surgeons who were trained within African sites, probably with contribution from HICs, but 93% of those who had some input, but the input had been local, actually stayed and carried on within those countries. So yes, I suppose your point is backed up with the evidence that's out there, the literature.
So another thing is retention of staff, because when we send people to study abroad, mostly they don't come back. So when they have like a training where they work with others, but in our setting, they tend to stay here and work for our countries.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, fine. Do we have any more comments on this paper? Because some of the points that we've raised now are also probably better discussed in the ACIT paper. So I was just going to move on to that unless anyone else has anything to add to this paper.
National Red Service.
Can you please mute yourselves? Thank you. And Iona, we have your messages on YouTube. We'll address them with the paper. Okay. Fine. So I'm just going to go back to the other paper, which is the ACIT paper. And can you still see my screen?
Sure, you can see it.
Brilliant. Okay, so the second paper is the ACIT paper, which has come up because actually the two papers very nicely come into each other and both discuss ethics with regards to global surgery. This paper is more specific to surgical trainees and their role and engagement in global surgery. The paper focuses on how global surgical trainees can engage in global surgery, discusses the barriers to engaging in global surgery, discusses the challenges that have been faced. So essentially with this paper, a consensus statement was developed after a meeting of 41 delegates at an ACIT meeting. And the aim of the paper was to address barriers and challenges faced by surgical trainees who are interested in global surgery. So the way the paper came across, the way the paper was put together was 41 participants with interest in global surgery contributed to this, and they ranged from students, registrars, trainees, and consultants. And there were 7 predetermined core areas which we'll be discussing today. So the consensus recommendations. The first thing that was discussed was challenges and barriers that trainees have faced when working in LMIC. So some of the trainees who contributed to this paper may have actually worked in LMICs for varying amounts of time. Some of them may have been involved in research, and some may have been involved from high-income countries. One of the main topics that they raised, which I think is very important to highlight, is recognizing one's limitations and competence. And I think that's something to easily take for granted because, you know, when we're in our host countries, our home countries, we're heavily supervised by our consultants, different bodies, whereas when we're visiting other countries, it seems as though we're not as closely supervised because we may not have our direct bosses or direct people who we answer to. And actually it means that when we're practicing during these trips, we need to take more responsibility for recognizing our own limitations. And actually going back to what Stuart had said, if in England, for instance, you're not allowed to do a hernia independently until ST5, then surely, you know, if you were going to another country, there's the discussion of should you be doing them independently at ST3 when at ST3 in your own country you're not allowed to do them, and discussing how you can address what your competence level is before you go across. Another thing was being unaware of expectations, and again that ties in very nicely to what Nivi mentioned about how when you're in a LMIC, if you're visiting an LMIC, you might expect that your role is strictly in the surgical capacity, whereas in reality you may be called on to do other things and fulfill other roles. And again, it's important that we have these discussions so that we're aware of the sorts of things that can be expected of us. Another aspect that was brought up was language barriers as something that could potentially be a challenge to be aware of, and it's something to consider in terms of choosing where we may engage in global surgery work. Quite interesting though, I quite like the fact that the paper focused on the duration, timing, type and location of global surgery efforts, because it's a very important discussion going back to ST5 versus ST3. What is the optimum stage for visits? What is the best, at what level are you able to give the best amount of, the best value to the country you're visiting, the hospital, the institution you're visiting? And I think the conclusion from the paper was that medicine is actually lifelong training, and it's important not to restrict junior trainees from going across simply because they can't, for example, do a hernia independently. And this paper very nicely highlights the fact that global surgery goes beyond just clinical duties. There's a lot of work that can be done in terms of research, advocacy, training, which Joseph mentioned during the discussion about how some of the best work that he's found has been to do with organization and capacity building. So it's important to recognize and to discuss amongst ourselves and know that actually it's not just when you're able to do operations, there's a lot more to do with global surgery. Then the duration of trips, this paper talks about how while shorter trips are easier to organize and logistically easier to manage, longer trips tend to be more research centered. And I suppose if it's the junior trainees who are in a better capacity to conduct research, then the question is, you know, how much time can you take out of training? Are you even allowed to go across. Which is another discussion we're going to get to, but just bringing it up here because the duration of the trip does impact your abilities to go, and the point at which you are in your training plays into this. Then the location, interestingly, all the different participants in this consensus seem to agree that the location was not as important as the fulfillment and the ability to contribute. So I suppose they were just trying to say it's not, it doesn't matter where you go, it's just as long as you're able to actually give a good amount of work and feel as though you've been able to contribute positively to wherever you've been. Support is a key factor. Support before you go, whilst you're there, before you, when you get back. Support all the way along the journey is important. The paper discusses how there had been a training course which was run by GASOC and ACIT on global surgery work, where the 3 bellwether operations where people were trained in the 3 bellwether operations, or just told about them and taught how to prepare for them. And this paper seemed to highlight that the trainees would like a lot more of these courses to run and would like them to be trainee focused so that they can actually contribute to what they're going across to do. Again, supervision is a key part locally in the LMIC and from home as well, because it's necessary to be able to have continuous supervision, ensure that the trainee is staying within their expected roles and supporting whatever challenges they might be facing. Health and safety considerations. This was interesting, as the paper suggested that the Royal Colleges may have a role to play with supporting health and safety preparation for global surgery work. It suggests that maybe the Royal Colleges can contribute to things such as travel care services, or just access to travel care services, and providing post-exposure prophylaxis, maybe not directly providing it, but just maybe substituting the cost for trainees who are interested in global surgery. That's an interesting way of sourcing it. I don't know if the Royal Colleges would be as keen, but it's an interesting thing to discuss. Funding for global surgery. Trainees who contributed to this paper had very varying experiences in seeking funding, but overall, a lot of the time it was self-funded. The kind of things that they've mentioned were bearing in mind salaries, mortgage payments, national insurance contributions as well, just things to bear in mind if ones were trying to plan a trip or thinking about planning a trip, the additional expenses that may not have been previously considered. And it also suggested that potentially there could be a forum for trainee to trainee exchanges, essentially where a trainee who is leaving may pass their car on to another trainee who's coming in. So maybe a car lease can be passed on, or rent can be passed on, and those sorts of things, where trainees who've been can pass on whatever they've managed to acquire, or can be bought, or some sort of exchange, so that new trainees don't have to go through the whole process of trying to find where to live and those sorts of things. It can make the process a bit smoother. And then the type of organisation that the global surgery work is conducted through, there are the options of charities, NGOs, faith-based organisations, which are quite popular in LMICs, direct contact, word of mouth. A lot of this just depends on the type of work that the trainee who's interested is interested in and where it's available. And I suppose also just making sure that it ties in with the kind of work that you're competent to do. So that is quite open to personal need. And then training boards. So this is one of the key things that's been raised by lots of trainees who are interested in global surgery, and this paper highlights it quite nicely, that permission to travel and engage in global surgery work whilst training whilst working as a surgical trainee in England is very often done under the umbrella of out of training or UPIs, and UPIs are, according to this paper, easier to to be granted. And essentially, there seems to be a lot of variation across deaneries, where some deaneries are more keen to encourage global surgery travel and work, whereas other deaneries think that focus should be on meeting training requirements for that period of time. And it just highlights, the benefits of global surgery work. It goes beyond that period of training. It goes even further into the benefits for the NHS. It's not just for that country. It's important to recognize that frugal technology, there is an exchange, there's a two-way exchange. There's a lot to be learned, a lot of frugal tech, beyond even just frugal technology. There's a lot to be learned from trainees going across and for both parts. And it's important to recognize, to see the bigger picture beyond just the 4 or 6 week trip. And then also that there is also room for development of audit projects, quality improvement projects, which are skills that we all know that the training boards are keen to encourage in surgical trainees here in England. Ethical considerations, which we've discussed in the other paper, so I won't go into detail of here. Just going back to the organisations, there was something I wanted to highlight, that the paper mentions and suggests a database which collects people's experiences from global surgery engagements and evaluations of their experiences, and suggests that this would probably be useful for future trainees if they knew which organizations work best with whichever aspects of surgery. So that's a discussion, and I think actually that could be a project from this journal club, whoever is keen to take forward. And okay. Finally, the recommendations from the paper as a summary are to encourage trainee involvement in global surgery. It's essential. The paper recommends that it's important to encourage development of courses that will prepare trainees for their global surgery efforts. Research in LMICs is very important. It talks about how global surgery goes beyond just clinical duties, and research is a very important aspect to consider. It then also talks about the surgical bodies and the deaneries here in England, and encourages actually the importance of recognizing global surgery trainee work, and also suggests that actually maybe beyond just recognizing it, it could start to count towards our overall point system at the end of our training, rather than just being additional work that doesn't have any significance in terms of our training requirements. And the database for global surgery opportunities. And it then goes back to the trainee, making sure that they've, to the best of their abilities, prepared adequately for their trip. So, questions? I'm just going to go back to the step page now. So, questions or contributions?
I think a lot of you're trying to say something.
Rover, we still can't hear you. Maybe type and then I'll read it out.
Okay. While she's typing, I can say something.
Yes.
So I think excellent presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So for us, for me, I can see some also challenges. Some challenges for fundings which come with people, and you see that the aim was not to stay in LMICs, but the money which they get from. So that also a challenge, and that is not sustainable. And another thing, I think one solution for LMICs is to know that it is our countries, those are our settings we are working on, and we have ownership of them, and try to solve the problems we have with the means we have, people can come and support, but the first step have to be ours. So to be engaged and try to change what we have, because I came in the UK, I went 2 times in the US, but I saw that the real problems we have in the LMICs are
Joseph, you were just about to tell us the real problems and then it cut off. Okay, whilst he's reconnecting, I'll just read out Robert's comments on the Skype group for the benefit of people who are joining us on YouTube, if you can't read them. So Robert has mentioned that, I'll start from here. So Stuart made a comment disagreeing with the comment about location. He believes that suitability of a placement and the stage of training that it's appropriate to go on is very location dependent. It's very different going to, for example, a rural district general in South Africa, where there's some senior staff around to support, compared to a hospital in rural Malawi, where you would be the most senior doctor there. I agree with that, Stuart. I think what I understood from the paper was suggesting that beyond just the level of hospital you're going to, I think what the paper was suggesting that overall, making sure that the experience you're going on is relevant to your training, is relevant to your level and your experience, is more important than just the physical location in terms of the country. But I do agree, going to rural district general hospital would always be a very different experience to going to a smaller hospital in Malawi, regardless of the country. And Iona made some comments on the YouTube page. So she had 2 questions. What is your opinion about high-income country trainees operating in LMICs for training purposes? And the second question is, do you believe that it is better to encourage high-income country trainees in other aspects of global surgery, i.e. advocacy, research, support building systems, etc.? I think those are great questions. Opinion about high-income countries training, high-income trainees operating in low-income countries. I think it's variable. I think it's different. There are things to gain, as Joseph has said, on both parts. But I think it's most important that the patient is at the center of whatever we're doing. So as long as we make sure that patient care is not compromised, and that also resources in those countries that we visit don't suffer as a result of our presence there, then it could be considered, I suppose, acceptable in that regard. But you're right, because there's a discussion of not using people in low-income countries as numbers to fill our logbooks, and that's a very valid discussion.
Can I say something there, Oro?
Yes, go on.
So I think, like I mentioned before, I don't think, numbers in that are an issue for us. And, our training is brilliant from a surgical point of view. So, we do have, certain rotations where we have international registrars that come through, especially our trauma departments, to learn. So that's something that's already established. One of our members, that's in the audience tonight, brought up a very valid point, and you've had it on one of your slides talking about trainee exchanges.
Yes.
And I think this is something that's would be a really good opportunity to look into. We've got the numbers in terms of the clinical skills to practice, in terms of being exposed to different conditions, getting your clinical confidence, especially within surgery. But with your previous presentation as well, we are completely aware of the fact that in terms of research, we are not where we'd like to be. And, from my experience in the UK, that would be something amazing that we could get from high-income countries, is helping to facilitate us develop our research systems within our country. And as as part of our surgical training, as part of most of our specialty trainings, we have to do what we call an M.Med paper, which is a kind of research paper that you do in order to get your qualification at the end. Something to the effect of, us being able to send a registrar over there for, 3 months or whatnot to work in a research setting to gain research skills. And we get a registrar. I'm just, throwing these ideas out there to practice clinical skills. I think we've got strengths on both sides that we could work with.
That's a very, very useful comment. Thank you, Nivi. And I suppose it's a response to Iona's question about our opinions about high-income countries, high-income country trainees operating in low-income countries, and the exchange that can be. It's important to address the need, isn't it? Going back to the paper, the need is important. What's the most important thing in this country? Is it clinical duties that are needed, or is it research? And it will always be different for different countries, different situations. It's just recognizing what it is and doing the best that we can to address it. So I'll just read Roba's comments on the Skype group. Roba's comment says that the title starts with engagement in global surgery. Roba finds it concerning that it's implied that engagement means a trip. The whole paper is about trips, and she really doesn't think that our trainees should come away with the idea that engaging with global surgery means a trip. She thinks we need to exchange ideas of how we have maximum impact if we want to truly be effective. And the idea of trips/missions, etc., is quite colonial, I agree, and we need to move away from that. And even though, yes, some trips are helpful, sure, it's helpful to you, but not necessarily to the host. I thank you for your comments, Roba. I completely agree with you. It's important to recognize what it is, again, it's highlighting what the need is and what we can do to contribute to this. It's not a trip, it is people's real lives that we're going to be dealing with. It's not just a holiday or a nice opportunity to practice. People are involved, health systems are involved. We need to see the full picture and to make sure that we can sit down and go through those 4 ethical questions and say, is this truly in the patient's best interest? Am I doing the least amount of harm that I can? Is this fair? Is this fair to every party? Every party that it works, that is part of the situation, part of the equation. And finally, does the patient actually want this? So I suppose it would have to be an individual assessment of each situation and recognizing that global surgery goes beyond just trips. They're not holidays, essentially. And
I think you got a lot of hate nods from the whole South African team there, Roba. Very, very much agree with everything that you said.
And Stuart's made a comment to provoke discussion here. We shouldn't be thinking that all LMIC-HIC interactions are framed around long-term strategy, is one comment offered. I'll read that again. We shouldn't be thinking that all LMIC-HIC interactions should be framed around long-term strategy. Can you explain that a bit?
I think you said something underneath.
And then there's a comment about, we also like the idea of exchanges. Here in Glasgow, we've hosted recent Malawian plastic and breast surgeon trainees with a bursary. So I suppose what Stuart's alluding to is that short-term, so again, or not again, short-term and long-term exchanges or short-term and long-term opportunities do have a role to play in global surgery. There will be times where what's in the best interest of the host country and the visiting surgeon is a short trip where clinical skills are taught in the context of a more senior consultant, I mean. And sometimes it will be that the best use of that time is for a junior trainee to go across and conduct an audit and to work at improving healthcare systems. So it's important to treat each case individually and to recognize what we're best able to provide, what needs we're best able to serve.
I also think, though, that a big issue that global surgery has notoriously had in the past is its lack of sustainability in efforts that have come through before. So with the short-term endeavors, I just need a little bit more expansion on what you think would be very useful or beneficial short-term endeavors, because I think, just like my personal opinion, is that almost everything that we do in global surgery has to be with a long-term kind of outcome in mind.
Yeah.
Not necessarily like strictly there, but a direction that we're heading in, and everything that we're doing and trying to achieve these long-term goals with lots of like short-term steps along the way.
Short-term experiences that can be beneficial would probably be from more senior consultants, I believe. So in terms of teaching clinical skills to other surgeons, I think those in that context, it can be useful, such as a new way of doing a hernia operation or something along those lines that can then be passed on, because within global surgery and within and across training between HICs and LMICs, a recurring theme is the importance of not just training and then stepping away, but training and then training trainers, so that these trainers can go on to train other trainers. So in that context, yes, it's possible. And the first paper we discussed highlighted the importance of establishing training within the countries that are visited, the LMICs that are visited. So training in that capacity can be a short-term experience, a short-term, I'm trying not to say trip now, but a short-term engagement. Great. And on the YouTube group as well, we have some comments from essentially saying that, responding to the question about whether it's better for high-income country trainees to engage in other aspects of global surgery rather than practicing. And the comment is in support of this and says, not better, it thinks that it should be both instead of either or. So it's important to do both sides of it, not just the clinical practice, but also research, advocacy, and training. And there's also mention of a comment from the Oxford Global Surgery short course where Professor Sharma mentioned, when I go to LMICs to help, I don't touch. I watch, but I don't touch. So Professor Sharma is a world-renowned global surgeon who made that comment because he recognizes the importance of respecting the local surgeons where we are and making sure that we're actually being useful in whatever capacity we're visiting. Okay. Do we have any other comments from anyone on this paper?
I think Robo was asking about methodology.
Oh, sorry, I missed Robo's comment. Robo's next comment was, I'm also concerned about the methodology of this paper to derive consensus recommendations. What does everyone else think about the methodology? Any comments on that before I that's my 2 cents? So I'll go back to what the methodology of the paper was. The paper was born out of a meeting, an ACIT meeting, where 41 participants who were interested in global surgery came together and developed 7 core areas that they sort of went back and forth and tried to fine tune, which is where these recommendations have come from. And they ranged from medical students all the way to consultants. But I agree, it is a small group of people, and it may not necessarily, and in fact, obviously from this conversation, it does not necessarily reflect the view of global surgery as a whole. It is a small select group. I suppose what's good about it is that it's provoking conversations such as this. And beyond it, some people from this Global Journal Club meeting can go ahead and improve on these recommendations and find things that are more encompassing of the entire global surgery group as a whole. Katrin in Glasgow says, people will always want to go on trips. So this is perhaps useful for those who want to do so responsibly. And Stuart's made a comment about need to think at 2 levels, trying to strategically improve the lot of the surgical patient in under-resourced settings is one important goal. It's not inconsistent for us to separately spend time abroad for more personal aims. I'm not really sure if that's referring to. Stuart, are you able to expand on that, please? Stuart, can you hear me?
Hello,
Yes, hi.
are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Oh, great. So what were you wanting more detail on?
So you mentioned that there were 2 areas. I'll just scroll up so I can read it. Thinking at 2 levels, trying to strategically improve the lot of the surgical patient in under-resourced settings is one really important goal, but that it's not inconsistent for us to separately spend time abroad for more personal aims. Can you just expand on that a little bit, please?
So I think as Roba, as Roba has been alluding to, the title presents itself very broadly, but actually, I think she's right. It's largely about us when we go abroad. However, I mean, people here in Glasgow are saying people are always going to want to go abroad and have fun trips.
That's true.
And maybe this kind of advice is useful
For people who
for trying to help people to do that correctly. But this is not a paper about how we change the lot of the underserved surgical patients. It's about something more specific.
That's very true. In terms of trainees and people wanting to go for trips, I suppose if you think about it, there will always be. It does sound quite exciting. It sounds like it will be a good opportunity, and it's a good way of encouraging interest in global surgery. But as we realise is very important, we need to not just encourage global surgery. It's important to encourage safe global surgery. And making sure that everybody's, and when I say safe, I don't just mean in terms of the practice or the surgical aspect of it, but safe and ethical global surgery is what we need to encourage. So I do agree with Robert's point that there is a danger that this paper may associate global surgery efforts with colonial trips and just visits for our benefit, when actually a lot of work that's going into global surgery goes far beyond that. A lot of it recognizes the full picture and recognizes the different aspects and the ethical considerations associated with these aspects. And Robert also goes on to raise some questions about how this paper doesn't discuss partnerships or how trips affect the receiving institution. There's no discussion about the patient, who's actually responsible for the patient when we operate, what happens when something goes wrong. It's also important to really think about what change we can actually make, and that the idea that as a trainee or a single surgeon, the idea that I'm going to make a difference is something that we need to rethink, as well as thinking about whether we're being respectful to our colleagues. And how would you, very great question, how would UK consultants respond to a Tanzanian trainee coming to his or her unit and wanting to implement change? Nivi, do you have a counter response to Roga's question? Nivi's response is that she loves it. No, it's true. It's a valid question. I think it's interesting when you contrast both papers, because the first paper considers all of the ethical arguments and tries to account for the positives as well as the negative aspects of global surgery engagement, whereas this paper almost is a bit more brochure-like and painting how to go on a trip. But it's not all negative, because people who also want to be engaged in global surgery for all the right reasons and all the ethical reasons will find bits of this paper useful. There are aspects of this paper which I think will be generally useful for the trainees, such as the discussion of a database that can be compiled that will encourage other trainees who are involved and let them know about experiences, what it's been like, expectations, which is probably the most important thing, so that people who are going are equipped mentally, physically, they have all the necessary equipment and can contribute in whatever way and be best prepared to do that.
Thank you, Omi. I left probably because of network.
Hi, Joseph.
It was an excellent presentation, but I think we have to take ownership on our side in the LMICs. If not, we will not have tangible or sustainable solutions.